Thank you very much for coming back, and at least some of you have come back to this session, a very interesting session on resilient infrastructure governance. We will have a very interesting discussion. A number of panelists have joined from different parts of the world, and we are very fortunate to have SRSG with us. So without much ado, I will ask her to give her opening remarks to kick off the event.
So thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you for all for persevering. It's been a long day, even although it's still the first day, but already a long day and very intense day. So thank you very much for being here. But it's an important side event. And it is really my great pleasure to open this on enhancing disaster resilience infrastructure governance. So first, let me thank the co-hosts, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI. And CDRI is still quite a young organization, but it has already become a very established leader in policy development and capacity support for disaster resilient infrastructure. And we, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we are very, very pleased, extremely pleased to be a close partner of CDRI. So we all know that infrastructure resilience is critical to achieving our development and climate goals. I think that was evident from the last session that we just enjoyed. And this is true in everything we build. Everything we build must be resilient to disasters, and this runs from essential social services, access to market, digital transformation, transition to clean energy. I mean, you name it. If it's not resilient and if it's not founded on a set of resilient infrastructure systems, it's not going to work. But the data that the member states send to us through the Sendai Framework Monitoring System, it shows that globally and annually around 100,000 critical infrastructure units are destroyed or damaged. And 40% of this damage is taking place in LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. So of course, this morning and afternoon, we had a good discussion about who is vulnerable, who is more impacted. And of course, everybody is impacted, but data shows that SIDS, LDCs, LLDCs are, in fact, very impacted. And the big question is, what can we do to make our infrastructure resilient? Now, there's a lot of commitment, pledges. We need to start from there, but that's not enough. We need strong leadership. We need to share good practice and effective governance. This is what we're going to talk about today, governance, and what governance and accountability mechanisms should governments put in place? This is the question in order to make our infrastructure systems resilient to, of course, current shocks, but also looking at the future risks as well. And effectively, this was one of the outcomes that came out from the midterm review process. The high-level meeting took place in New York, and many of you in this room were there. How can we make our infrastructure resilient? And one of the big questions, or one of the big answers that came out was, we need to strengthen governance for risk-informed and resilient infrastructure. And I'd like to share with you two more concrete points about this. So one of the points is that this governance has to be supported by legal and regulatory frameworks, because if not, it is not good enough. And these legal and regulatory frameworks should mention, so who is responsible and who needs to be accountable for the resilience of infrastructure. Because unless we have this, we cannot have standards that are key to fostering investment in resilience and collaboration among key stakeholders. And second, what is also important is to have a multi-hazard risk assessment. This should be a prerequisite for infrastructure investment and good governance. and also stress testing of critical infrastructure systems need to be conducted. And we're going to hear later from country representatives where this kind of stress testing is actually happening. And the relevance about talking of governance of resilient infrastructure here is because the G20 countries are in the position to be able to lead in implementing these calls to action from the midterm review of the Sendai Framework implementation, both domestically and in terms of your international cooperation. And I do hope that the communiqué, which is being intensively negotiated today, will further enhance the commitment of G20 countries, member countries in this aspect. And this is because G20, you have so much to offer in terms of first documenting and sharing good practices on governance, second, enhancing regulatory and legislative frameworks for infrastructure resilience, and you also can promote common standards for the development, financing, and maintenance that we talked about of resilient infrastructure. And of course, you can count on UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction's support in implementing this critical work and responding to the calls to action. Now, one area where UNDRR can concretely support your efforts is in the implementation of the G20 principles for quality infrastructure investment through what we call the Principles for Resilient Infrastructure. This is a set of 6 principles, and it was discussed, consulted by more than 100 countries, and it was facilitated by UNDRR. And we are already working with CDRI to turn these principles for resilient infrastructure into a global methodology for conducting infrastructure resilience reviews and stress testing. All G20 countries, you can use this methodology to build risk-informed and resilient infrastructure and reach what we call a net resilience gain. What is a net resilience gain? This means that each of the interventions that you make around infrastructure will contribute to the resilience of the interconnected systems of infrastructure in your national level. So with that said, I'd like to give the floor back to Kamal and start this discussion. Thank you, Kamal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, SRSG, and thank you everyone for coming back here. When we were setting the priorities for the Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group under our G20 presidency, we looked at the 5 areas that you're very familiar with, and some of the colleagues, they pointed out, why are we not talking about governance, because that underpins everything. Governance and capacity, these are things which came up again and again in terms of feedback as to why we are not emphasizing that. And our answer was that, well, this is something that should underpin everything that we do. And this morning, those of you who participated in the negotiations on the communique, you saw that the notion of resilience, the different aspects of governance kept coming up again and again. So by way of kicking off these discussions, basically, I would like to pose 5 broad questions, which we should try to address during our discussions today. In the previous session, you saw the presentation that Andrew made about increased risk, the possibilities, the whole band of risk as a result of climate change, which means that there is a need to enhance our standards and regulations. So can we come up with a process? What should be the process for upgrading regulations and standards in countries and laws in country? My own experience of having worked in the government for 8 years now is that whenever there is an event, whenever there is a particular incident, extreme event or its consequence, there is a tendency to jump into, okay, let's change the law, let's bring in this regulation. But all of those policy decisions, all of those governance decisions have long-term implications. So how do we have a deliberative process of designing regulations and standards that meet our needs now and into the future, and they do not represent a knee-jerk reaction? The second question is, in the context of disaster risk management, including disaster resilient infrastructure, what does rule of law mean? What are the consequences for not following building bylaws? What is the balance between the rights of the citizens and duties of the citizens? Yes, you must follow the building bylaw, but you also need to have access to risk information. That's your right. You need to have access to capacities. You need to have capacity to, this kind of thing played out in the pandemic, where there are fines for not wearing a mask. But do you have access to masks? Isn't it the state's responsibility to ensure that there is access to masks? So I think we really need to unpack this whole notion of rule of law in the context of disaster risk management. Under the sort of broader umbrella of humanitarian, we have often sidestepped the issue of a rule of law in the context of disaster risk management. So how do we do that? How do we make sense of it, unpack it? That is something I would like to pose. Yesterday, when we had this discussion, that's my third point, and Eric from FEMA talked about the limitations of making risk information available public. What happens when you make risk information public, but it is not accurate? Or, you say that this place is not in flood zone, but it gets flooded. So what are the limits to transparency of risk information? How do you ensure that transparency works to enhance risk management practices and not to create confusion or panic in the public? So that's a question that I would like to pose. What does transparency mean in the context of disaster risk management? Fourth point, there is this, when we were working, Michael and I, in post-tsunami recovery back in 2005, one overused phrase was subsidiarity principle, which is put capacities, responsibilities, accountabilities as close to the ground as possible. What does subsidiarity principle mean in the context of infrastructure governance? When you are setting up a national infrastructure pipeline, an infrastructure which connects, one part of the country to the other and connects multiple levels of governance, how would it play out? I don't have an answer to it, but this is a deep question which needs to be addressed. In the last session, Rita challenged us that participation, and when we stepped out of the room, she expressed her displeasure at the response she got. She said that, okay, now schools and, local level rain harvesting, you've left that to women. And all of this big infrastructure, the $1 trillion infrastructure, that will all be decided by men. So men will decide where the power lines will go, where the energy infrastructure will go, where the roads will go, where the airports will go, and women will do water conservation. So the question is, what does participation mean? Participation is a key pillar of good governance. So what does participation mean in the context of disaster resilient infrastructure governance? Who do you consult? Who participates in decision making? How does that practically happen? It is one thing to advance it as a principle, but practically how does it happen? So I think these are 4 or 5 questions. How do we do regulation and standards? What does rule of law mean? Limits to transparency. Are there any subsidiarity principle? And then, of course, the participation. With that, we have an exciting panel from a number of small island developing states. We'll start with Mauritius. We have our colleague from the Ministry of Local Government. So he will talk about subsidiarity principle, I hope. He is Senior Chief Executive of the Ministry of Local Government and Disaster Risk Management in Mauritius. SIDS have unique challenges. They have challenges in terms of economies of scale, lack of redundancy in infrastructure systems. So what is your expectation from G20? What is your expectations from key knowledge partners, UNDRR, from CDRI, and the others? So maybe you can reflect on your experience, your perspective from Mauritius. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very interesting question. And for us, SIDS countries, we are limited by size. We've got our inherent drawbacks, shortcomings. And for us, G20 can be very helpful in the sense that you've got the knowledge. You can share with us your best practices. You can assist us in accessing finance. You can provide support, just to name a few. But the only thing is that very often knowledge is not readily available. What I would appeal to the G20 is to provide necessary technical assistance based on the requirements of the SIDS countries, because we are different, we face different challenges. It is not that we just copy and paste. Things are different, but what we would wish to see is to have best practices adapted to our conditions.
Thank you very much. So the key point you're making is easy access to knowledge and capacities to make the most of what is the state-of-the-art knowledge. With that, now let's move to Trinidad and Tobago. We have Mr. Anwar Baksh joining in from Trinidad and Tobago. He is Planning and Development Officer at the Mitigation Planning and Research Unit with the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management in Trinidad and Tobago. In the previous two meetings, our working group has discussed the importance of common principles and standards for resilient infrastructure to ensure continuity of services and safeguard investments. Trinidad and Tobago has recently applied UNDRR's principles for resilient infrastructure and stress testing methodology to strengthen governance for infrastructure resilience. So, Mr. Baksh, can you please tell us about your experience in this regard and how you engaged multiple parts of your government in this process? What regulatory and policy changes are required to ensure the resilience of infrastructure from development of infrastructure through to its maintenance and operation? Mr. Baksh.
Namaste, good morning, good afternoon, SRS Street Director, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion from my side of the world. Indeed, we are in fact implementing the principles for resilient infrastructure as we speak, with tomorrow being one of my sessions for the stress testing in our islands. And just to say, how are we engaging all levels of government agencies? Because we are two islands, it is critical for us to do the stress tests on both islands within our key sectors. Trinidad and Tobago has what is known as the National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Multi-Sectoral Committee. It's a long name, but it's really that government-approved platform of all ministries, divisions, and agencies where we would utilize this platform to mainstream disaster risk reduction and also climate change adaptation within reason. So we have utilized this participatory approach of engagement within this platform, but we have also sought to co-op members onto this stress testing sessions so that we can understand that they can be engaged, that they can rank the impacts of certain hazards against their sector's operations. And we are looking at 7 sectors as a pilot, the oil and gas, energy, transportation, telecommunication, water and wastewater and drainage, education and health. So we have been continuously learning from these sectors. We are learning how there are compounding impacts of hazards across sectors. We are looking at solutions of nature-based solutions into building the resilience of our infrastructure, and it's very much a participatory approach. So we are not sitting behind a desk, we are going towards the sectors, we are having workshops, and these things are critical for us as we build our action plan for resilient infrastructure. As we do this, we are also moving towards advancing a risk information exchange platform where we can harmonize all disaster data to allow for transparency of disaster data sharing, and that we can do impact-based forecasting moving forward to inform developmental planning. And this is very critical for us as we utilize the same platform in Trinidad and Tobago to build our resilience, not only to critical infrastructure, but to the entire of our islands. So we are moving towards the entire policy-informed decision-making planning sessions, and we are hopeful that through these G20 initiatives, that there is a way of knowledge sharing and capacity building through best practices and expertise by G20 countries, that there can be probably a crucial role in providing financial support and in terms of maybe concessional loans when we do have an action plan developed, or maybe things like partnerships to attract investments to small island developing states like Trinidad and Tobago, and these things are critical for all of us. So we are thankful for the UNDRR for giving us the opportunity to implement this principles for resilient infrastructure. We were actually part of the global discussions that formed these principles, and we are happy to be here. So thank you, and we look forward to the further deliberations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baksh. Very interesting examples of how you're using some of these stress testing tools to look at different sectors and different hazards and ranking risks emanating from those. So that was very interesting, and we can see how we can facilitate knowledge sharing among different island nations to apply those methods. I now hand over to SRSG to lead us in the discussion with the next 3 speakers from some leading think tanks, networks of professionals, and private companies. SRSG.
Thank you. So actually it's going to be 2 because the first speaker that we were going to have, he had to move to another meeting because we were being a bit delayed. But I'm delighted to introduce Ms. Sabina Carluccio, who is the Executive Director at the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. Ms. Carluccio has been working very closely with both UNDRR and CDRI in recent years to develop common principles and standards for resilient infrastructure. So my question for you, Ms. Carluccio, is that from this experience, what do you think are the most urgent and immediate policy and regulatory changes for resilience in infrastructure that G20 countries need to make as the climate crisis intensifies around us? And in particular, in today's globalized world, what should the G20 do to promote common principles and standards for resilience of interconnected infrastructure systems, including those that cross borders? Ms. Carluccio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this question, and good afternoon, good evening all, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts today. So just taking your question in two parts. First part is around the policy and regulatory changes for infrastructure resilience. So there's no doubt that we need to urgently build resilience into our existing policies and regulation. And this means that we need to accept that not all risk can be predicted, so therefore mitigated. And we also then need to focus on limiting the consequences of a hazard event. And this is particularly useful when we're planning for emerging and uncertain risks. And on the other hand, we also need to better understand and to consider in policy and in regulation the systemic interdependencies of our infrastructure networks and systems. So we heard about strengthening governance systems. And I would say that we should really think of governance as a catalyst for shared responsibility and collective action. So we should really pursue the multi-level governance approach where the policy is developed across level of governments and agencies and departments, and allow for that vertical, but then very importantly, horizontal coordination, cooperation. And we heard just now the example from Trinidad and Tobago where this is being put in practice, where then you create that shared responsibility for decisions and outcomes to improve infrastructure resilience and then ultimately develop aligned policy. And on the point of aligned policies, we need to align disaster risk management, critical infrastructure protection, and climate change adaptation policies. Again, we heard something similar has been done in Trinidad and Tobago, but we need to really acknowledge and climate change with the uncertainty that it introduces, and it forces us to think about the long term and build adaptation. That makes siloed and shorter term policy and regulation even more inadequate than before. So, for example, in the European Union, countries are asked to develop a national disaster risk assessment and identify and assess risk of critical infrastructure. But are also encouraged to develop national adaptation plans. But these two policies are more often than not disconnected, and so this needs to change as a matter of course. So on the standards, government should mandate development of resilience standards for key infrastructure sectors. And from my experience, I think they should also use stress testing to help assure them. So any new resilience standard needs to be adequately monitored, and the infrastructure operators need to be empowered and also incentivized to meet them, including through regulation. And linked to this, governments should actively engage with private sector on resilience standards and also on investment, and to create those incentives that are supported by risk-based performance. So establishing those partnerships with the private sector to identify those common goals and the shared interest that they have, public and private sector, in governance and management of critical infrastructure risks. From a regulation perspective, I would commend establishing multi-sectoral regulation. So regulators that are able to coordinate across more than one infrastructure sector and really ensure that interdependencies are considered and managed adequately. And in addition, regulators, and I heard the point about transparency, but I think regulators should facilitate collection of risk data and make disclosure of disaster risk mandatory. They should be empowered to collect data such as asset condition or maintenance requirements, disclosure of risk, including physical climate risk, and then they should be able to set those performance indicators to ensure that level of service do not deteriorate over time, and that the adequate funding is allocated to maintenance and replacement activities for existing infrastructure, for example. So I hear about the transparency and the kind of sharing of data, but I do think that this type of data is essential to implement resilience standards. So on the second part of your question, and briefly, what should the G20 do to promote the common principles and standards for resilience? So in my experience, governing bodies and institutions can struggle to engage with resilience, and this could be because of the lack of common basic understanding of what infrastructure resilient is, other than available resources and technical capacity. But this is where the principles for resilient infrastructure that you've introduced previously could really help, because they can provide that normative goals for systemic resilience, and they also meet the SDGs and the Sendai framework targets. So they absolutely provide those type of goals that we should be aiming for. And and again, like governments could also use those principles to communicate the desired outcomes and to set the ambition for resilience and continuity of critical services. And I think this would go a long way to provide clarity and to provide direction to regulators and investors. And then government should promote these common principles to support evidence-based development of infrastructure resilience. So having that consistent set of principles and indicators and interventions can enable governments to make the decision on a more consistent basis and in a more transparent way, and prioritize what they are competing options and projects and policy drivers. And so you mentioned the stress testing methodology, and I think that is one good way where we can provide a systematic evidence-based analysis to prioritize investment and inform policy development. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Carluccio, for walking us through very comprehensively on what governance for resilient infrastructure should be. So indeed, we should start by thinking that it's not only about emerging risk, but the uncertainty in the future that we are facing. And I remember, Kamal, that you stressed this a lot. And based on that, the importance of multi-sectoral governance, the importance on shared responsibility, including with the private sector, and in terms of common standards, if we do not have common standards, then governments will struggle to come up with what should be the governance of resilience infrastructure. And I just wanted to share with you that this session of the General Assembly, a resolution on resilient infrastructure was adopted, sponsored by Poland, by many other governments. And as part of that resolution's implementation, during the next session of the General Assembly, there will be a one-day session, a full-day session on resilient infrastructure convened by the President of the General Assembly. So I believe this will be a very important opportunity to take this agenda to all member states. So thank you very much, Ms. Carluccio. And the last speaker for the panel is Mr. George Karagiannis, who is the director of the Engineering Leadership Group at Resilient First. And I'd like to share with you that a group of engineers also did the midterm review from their point of view, which was very encouraging. So, Mr. Karagiannis, the questions, I should say. What are the systemic issues that make infrastructure vulnerable to current shocks and future changes? What changes do we need for infrastructure governance and decision-making across infrastructure life cycle to improve current levels of resilience and ensure that future challenges are also addressed? And if you can also focus a bit on the SIDS, the most vulnerable countries, including SIDS and LDCs, based on your experience of working with these countries, and tell us how can these changes be considered in decisions about infrastructure resilience. So over to you, Mr. Karagiannis.
Thank you very much, Madam SRG. Mr. Chair, thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, with regard to current shocks and future changes to infrastructure, obviously climate change sets the curve in that it's increasing the severity and frequency of natural hazards, and these are obviously affecting infrastructure systems. Problem is that this is a statistical outcome. It does not mean that all storms and all floods will be worse every year, and that is posing a systemic challenge to making policies and justifying policies, probably against nearsighted electorates. Climate change is exacerbating extreme weather events. In other words, some years are going to be better, some will be worse. The number of bad years is already on the rise, and they're much worse than what they used to be. Overall, it's estimated that climate change could increase the global annual direct cost of weather-related disasters by about 20% by 2040. If we account for indirect costs, that increase is threefold. At the same time, we're facing aging infrastructure systems, not least in small island development states and least developed countries. Interestingly enough, even when it comes to the most complex of infrastructure systems, and I mean information technology and communication systems, one of the most frequent failures is natural hazards and not cyber attacks, as one would think. Now, the systemic issues, against those shocks, there are systemic issues that contribute to vulnerability. One is that systems are not designed for climate change. They're not designed to be exposed to higher hazard intensities. They're not designed to be exposed to hazards. They were not until now, for example, flood zones, and they were not designed to be stressed because of increasing demands, like increased power use during the summer. Furthermore, there is epistemic uncertainty about how climate change is actually going to happen, and fundamentally, systemically, for want of a better expression, infrastructures are public goods provided by private companies, which brings about what I call the hazard mitigation paradox, which essentially is the fact that although hazard mitigation projects, not least when it comes to infrastructure systems, have a high benefit to cost ratio, their cost structure makes them unattractive, at least in the short run. With that in mind, the repair cost in the aftermath of disasters is only a fraction of the total economic losses, and it shows at the accounts of a different entity than the actual business cost. That brings to the credit risk policy. Credit risk is the most important metric in the private sector. Everything gets boiled down into that. And embedded in credit risk analysis is the assumption that the future looks something like the past. And this is becoming increasingly an incorrect assumption. It's roughly like driving by looking in the rearview mirror. Last but not least, in terms of systemic issues contributing to vulnerability, is a skewed disaster preparedness approach. In the private sector, natural disasters are either insured against in enterprise risk management approaches or accepted as force majeure in business continuity plans. Roughly speaking, they're not taken seriously into consideration. Infrastructure sectors are unequally regulated, and when it comes to infrastructure operators, we're seeing a business as usual approach to disaster preparedness and response. The strategy, the overall strategy seems to be the one of adding more resources in an attempt to save the problem. So what do we need to do? How do we need to change infrastructure governance and decision-making to enhance resilience? Several of my fellow panelists and you, as a matter of fact, have pointed out before that risk assessments are needed not only to identify the level of risk, but also to guide decisions, including investment decisions, and mobilize public and private capital. They inform the cost-benefit analysis that's needed to justify government budget allocations and support the estimation of net present value required to bring in the private investment that's going to be required. However, they need to account for the uncertainties of climate change, which means that they need to account for the potential impact, but they also need to account for the uncertainties, the realistic uncertainties. We also need to balance a life cycle approach with the epistemic uncertainty inherent in long-term projections. Infrastructure risk assessments are essentially a multidisciplinary exercise that requires expert collaboration spanning a lot of technical disciplines. Several approaches have been developed, including but not limited to stress testing. Another is the physical climate risk assessment method that is also used to that effect. However, the one interesting point is the timescales of investment decisions versus those of climate projections. The private sector needs shorter term projections than climate change analyses 10 years is an eternity for most investment decisions. Second, we need a whole community approach. We need to bring together public and private actors to collectively identify and lead strategies for infrastructure resilience. Third, there is no way we can future-proof all of our assets against all of our risks. So we have to become a lot better at disaster response and recovery. Infrastructure operators need comprehensive emergency management programs. Sequential damage control approaches do not work in disasters. They cannot address multiple simultaneous incidents. Project management approaches aren't fit for a dynamic risk environment. They need to put together search capabilities and resource typing to assist mutual aid. And ideally, we need a capabilities-based approach. Essentially, we need to avoid the trap of planning for what we can manage. The principles for resilient infrastructure essentially capture those and more changes that are required to infrastructure governance and decision making. My personal favorite is number one, the continuously learning, not least because continuous improvement is one of the fundamental tenets of disaster resilience, which is my background. So the need for developing and updating the understanding of risk and the insight into infrastructure resilience is paramount to maintain forward-looking infrastructure and decision-making guidance. Last but not least, I'd like to emphasize that the private sector needs to be a lot more active, and we need to bring in a lot more of private sector organizations in our resilience endeavor. And this is where the engineering leadership group that I'm coordinating, joint initiative between Resilience First and the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, comes in. I'll stop at that. Thank you very much again for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karagyanis, and it's very important that you focused a lot on the private sector, because it's true, as you say, that that infrastructure as a public good is provided by private companies. If I remember correctly, and forgive me if it's not correct, but I believe that there was a statistics that say that by 2040, that was it $92 trillion of new infrastructure will be constructed, 80% invested by the private sector. And another thing that I wanted to share with you is that one of the outcomes of the midterm review process is that, I don't want to generalize, but it's a finding that still the private sector, by and large, look at disaster risk reduction as not their matter, but the public sector's matter. So I think that, you showed us, you shared with us a long list of what the private sector needs to be looking at, and for that, what governance should look like. But I think it's extremely important, those aspects, in light of what I just shared. So thank you very much. I'm going to give it back to Kamal for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mami, for that. We had really good interventions from the panelists, very rich. So I will not try to sort of reflect on that too much right now, but invite you to engage in a conversation, ask questions. So the floor is now open to ask questions to any of the panelists. Yes, Nishikawa-san, please.
Thank you for the very rich and enlightening discussions. And now I'd like to emphasize that infrastructure involves numerous civil engineers all over the world. Maybe millions, more than millions, maybe billions of civil engineers working on the ground every day to struggle to protect their community and their country. Now, they are quite busy, I guess. And I'd like to emphasize the importance of a reality check of various discussions that we do in our conference rooms. Early this morning, we found that there are, of course, differences between countries who have experienced geophysical hazard and who have not experienced geophysical hazard. In that sense, would it be really realistic to have a common standard? But is it enough to, I guess it's enough to have a comparable standard, because countries with earthquakes and no earthquakes, they are quite different. Regarding small island countries, where their geography is usually very steep and narrow, the rivers are narrow. On the continents, the rivers are very flat and long. So there are physical, geological differences, geographical differences. So the question is, how can you make the reality check of the international discussions with the real workers who are the responsible in their countries and communities regarding infrastructure? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nishikawa-san, for highlighting that we cannot have the same standard for different geographical, economic, and risk context. The underlying principles may be the same, but we need to do the reality check as to what will work in a given situation. Any other questions? Ratnu and then Santosh.
I'm Rajendra Ratnu, Executive Director, National Institute of Disaster Management. Thank you for bringing up a panel with very exciting ideas. And the first panelist, I'm forgetting the name, who joined online, talked about a point that it requires various agencies and departments collaboration, which is a very important point in any infrastructure planning. And I'll just, Kamal knows it, but for the benefit of other audience, like India has done a very, very progressive reform in infrastructure planning. And I was also involved in the drafting. This plan is called National Master Plan for Multimodal Connectivity and Last Mile Connectivity. So this plan applies to all the 500 crore and above. I don't know what will be the million term equivalent of 500 crore rupees. Those plans are being looked by multi agencies at the planning and at the DPR stage itself. So my question is that how the resilience angle also can be built into the same governance structure in India, and how it can also lead to some of the learnings for other countries, as this platform is backed by more than 1,600 GIS layers in the planning process. And that leads to, many of the environmental aspects are taken care of, but explicitly to build in the resilience angle, so that the same technical group can analyze these projects from that thing, and how the learnings can be taken to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratnu. George, Savina, anyone else wants to answer that? The question in summary is, how do we make resilience an integral part of upstream planning of infrastructure systems, where we look at multiple infrastructure sectors together, plan at a higher level? Ratnu mentioned specifically multimodal connectivity, bringing together railways, roadways, shipping networks, and so on. So how do we embed resilience at the upstream level while planning infrastructure systems?
I'll share some thoughts on and that connect back to the principles for resilient infrastructure, and as they are kind of overarching principles that can guide really that type of resilience embedment at upstream and into kind of different governments, ministries and departments. And a methodology that is being used for implementation in different countries, so different contexts, and Trinidad and Tobago has been one example today, but there are other ongoing implementation projects, is using principles to conduct a national level assessment. So using the principles and the KPI, second KPI that comes with those principles, and then conduct that assessment at national level to identify systemic vulnerabilities and gaps across all sectors of infrastructure. And then bring it back to the kind of in a national kind of dialogue amongst all the different ministries and agencies and key actors in the infrastructure development. Then this type of dialogue with the knowledge of systemic vulnerabilities based on those high-level common principles in the kind of upstream development of infrastructure, then kind of brings, so it's not the same for each country. Obviously, it will differ, but the methodology allows for some level of consistency, and also allows for different countries that undergo this type of methodology to learn from each other. So learn what wasn't worked, and how they're dealing with embedding resilience in the upstream part of infrastructure development into the policy development. And therefore, further their learning and then kind of scale up implementation of this type of methodology. So when you bring together those different stakeholders from different ministries, that's where the conversation then gets into everyone is on the same page, everyone understands what resilient infrastructure is, where the systemic vulnerabilities are, what sort of prioritization as a collective, like you decide on prioritization of gaps and addressing it and decide on action plans and all of that. So I think the value is in the process and in the methodology, and that's obviously being tested and implemented, but also the value will also be in the learning from each other from different contexts and countries.
Thank you very much, Savina, for that very reflective answer to that question on how we integrate resilience at the upstream planning level. I'll take one last question. Santosh had his hand up, and Michael. I'll take two because Michael is the second one, so I can't say no.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful session, and two things which I considered at this point of planning. That one aspect is the new infrastructure, which Mami mentioned, that 98 trillion and 80% is this, the kind of a thing which is coming up. And the second is inbuilt environment. So the two things, one is the new one and the inbuilt environment. So public policy gaps, which comes in the terms of that how much public policy is actually enforcing in prioritizing investment for resilience. And that we talk about in terms of whether we should go for the economic sector or whether we go for the social sector. And also we can combine both economic sector and the social sector, like monuments and countries. So these things are actually giving, and to withstand with the cascading challenges, which is coming up, not one disaster, which is one multiple disaster leading to other. So in this kind of a scenario, how we can actually go for prioritization where the funding gap is huge. And the second is that we have to go together, like economic sector we need also, and also we need social sector to push. So in this dichotomy, how we are actually framing our public policy for investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a key question. How do we prioritize across different classes of infrastructure sectors? How do we prioritize a resilience need? It's a big question. But before I invite the panelists to answer, maybe we can take the second question also. So Michael, you can pose your question and then those can be addressed together.
Okay. Thank you, Kamal, for the opportunity, and thank you to all the sponsors. And all the people who have contributed. The panel today was great and very thought-provoking. And I guess one thing that I'm struggling with is that we're talking about the big challenges that we have to do with infrastructure and how much we have to build, and yet all the problems that come with it. The previous panel talking about there's a lot of environmental degradation, there's a lot of problems on the resource side. We know we have to do this net zero, and yet we're talking about the complexity of systems, which clearly there's a huge amount of uncertainty. All of this is coming together, and I can't help but feel that, quite frankly, we can't see what's coming. I mean, COVID, as Kamal knows, I did some work with pandemic preparedness with the UN, and we didn't see anything coming. And all we could do was look back, and then you get hit with something like COVID that really, you can't see everything that's happening. Now, all of this coming to me and everything that's said about coming back and sort of reassessing the risk as events happen, it comes back to a lot of what you said, Kamal, at the start about that underlying this is governance. And I can't help but feel that really, I mean, the G20 may not necessarily have the best leadership in this space, that it may be within some of the G20 countries, it may be more the communities, the solutions that they have managed to find maybe need to come up and percolate that many in the G20 may not have listened to or may not be aware of, because the future is going to require some solutions that we don't have now. And communities will have to find their own ways to solve these very complex and interrelated problems. So I'm sort of struggling with this as a governance concept. How can we bring some of the risk concept that we have here, but actually really listen and empower communities to find solutions that will address the challenges in the future that we really can't anticipate?
The second question also very challenging. How are we going to deal with an uncertain future? We don't know what kinds of disasters might happen in the future. In that context, how do we build systems that have empowerment, capacity, resources at the local level? And there is we talk a lot about upstream engagement, but is that really the only way to do it? How do you do that while also empowering local level? Recognize some of the coping approaches or innovation that may be happening at the local level. So I invite the panel to address these two questions. I'm very glad that I'm moderating and not being a panelist, because these questions can't be answered easily.
If I can offer such a comment for the second to last question, learning from Trinidad, we're still learning in Trinidad and Tobago, but as we conduct this stress test for these sectors, we have also placed onto the forefront the economic sector to conduct this stress test with us, so that they can understand that there are gaps that will be identified, and there is a need for us to have this financing mechanism developed to now complement the action plan that will be built at the end of our test and our project. So we are learning from the process, and we are still hoping to learn from others who may have gone through this process, but it's one way in which we are looking to be able to prioritize investments with that financial understanding of a resilient infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anwar Baksh, for those reflections relating your Trinidad Tobago experience, application of stress testing for some prioritization. George, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kamal. It was the second question I wanted to reflect upon. I agree in that there is no way we can predict everything that can come our way. However, what we've tried in the past and has worked is an approach whereby you don't begin by asking what can go wrong. You begin by asking, what do I rely upon the most? So the wrong question, at least in my humble opinion, is to answer what can happen, what can nature throw at us, right? The right question to answer is, try to answer at least, is what do we rely upon? If I had a magic button and I could at the push of that button destroy one piece of critical infrastructure in a country, in a community, in a small island developing state, in an LDC, and so on, what would that be? And as soon as we have figured out that, then we can go on and identify what can go wrong at this facility, what it is at risk from, put redundancies in place, make the grid more resilient, add alternatives, and so on, right? So how can I also agree that this is a local problem, and well, more of a local problem and less of a government problem, at least to the extent that some infrastructure systems are local. To the extent that some other infrastructure systems, for example, power grids, are national and to a certain extent internationally interconnected, that is also a national and potentially international problem. So what can governments do? One, they can encourage that kind of approach to national-sized infrastructures. And second, they can encourage communities to adopt that kind of approach in their own infrastructure. And the know-how is out there. The stress testing approach takes it's a methodology that at least alludes to that sort of mindset, at least partially. Right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. You really gave another perspective on how to frame this problem and not start from the side of what could go wrong, but look at what one would rely on and then see what kind of shocks it may be subjected to and work from there. So very interesting perspective. I think something to think about when we talk about systemic risk. Savina, do you have any reflections on this? Yes, your hand was up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Kamal. Yeah, just a quick point on governance, and then maybe it's a bit philosophical, but when we think about governance for infrastructure, and then we think about governance for resilience of infrastructure, I think that the additional characteristic there, just because uncertainty and dealing with complexity and uncertainty is such a key tenet for resilience, then the governance for infrastructure resilience also needs to have that quality of being adaptive, being reflective, and being able to kind of like so as I said, adapt to whatever gets thrown at us, because one of the things I learned working on resilience is that, and that stuck with me, is like we need to be prepared to be surprised. That's kind of one of the key things. And so therefore, the governance for infrastructure resilience, I think, needs to have that quality.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think adaptive governance is a lot that is something which is being talked about a lot these days. It comes with its own challenges, and I can give you an example. During the early phase of the pandemic, when we applied the disaster management law to contain the pandemic or flatten the curve, so to speak. And we would issue some instructions, some rules, and then we would sort of get feedback from the field that this is a problem, and then we'll issue an amendment to that. And I think from the central government itself, perhaps there were more than 300 notifications. So to me, it is adaptive governance. But to our critics, they don't know their mind. They keep changing the rules every day. So what I'm trying to say is that from a public policy perspective, adaptive governance is difficult to implement, But I guess there is no alternative if we have to deal with uncertainties and surprises of the future. Our colleague from Mauritius, would you like to reflect on anything that has been discussed?
Thank you, Mr. Kamal. Mauritius being a small island state, we also faced challenges during the COVID pandemic. And given that it's a small country, we were having a flexible way of doing things, always trying to improve based on the situation. And we've been able to contain the pandemic, and but we've had to close our tourism industry, where government provided financial support in order to help the tourist hotels, and provided financial support to all people working in the different industries. But it was an adaptive governance, because in Mauritius it doesn't take long to prepare regulation. Everything goes fast, and we've got a very receptive government, because the government looks for immediate action. And immediate action means fast, understanding the situation, and to be at the forefront of everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, we close. But before we close, Mami, would you have any final reflections?
So there are 7 targets, global targets of the Sendai framework, and member states submit their data against them. The target D, which is about damage to critical infrastructure and disruption to basic service, is the one where the least data is being submitted. I think member states are still struggling to even look at what they think is critical and what has been the damage and the disruption. So in a nutshell, what I want to say is that this is an area that during the next 7 years of the implementation of the Sendai framework, we really need to come to grips together. And I think the richness of today's discussion shows that there is a strong willingness to do so. And of course, it's so challenging, as many of you have pointed out, but definitely it is an area of importance that has come out strongly from the midterm review. And just one more thing is the local resilience in terms of the governance. Because, of course, when it comes to maintenance of infrastructure, there's a lot that is put on the local authorities. Do they have the capacity? Do they have the expertise? And here one of the principles is about shared responsibility. Who does what and how is it shared? I think this is something important that we also need to think about.
Thank you very much. At the end, I would like to thank the UN, DRR, and CDRI colleagues for putting together this very nice, very informative, very thought-provoking session. Thank you very much.